Welcome back after the break. Now for our stories in detail, we'll start from Saudi Arabia, where the Organization of Islamic Cooperation has condemned the US decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. The 14th summit of the 57-member organization has been held in Mecca. The OIC opposed any measures prolonging Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories and undermining the two-state solution. The final statement also condemned the persecution of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar and urged a halt to the violence. The communique expressed concern at the world's growing Islamophobia. The meeting rejected the US decision to recognize Israeli sovereignty over Syria's occupied Golan Heights. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan says the resolution of the Kashmir issue under UN resolutions is inevitable. He was speaking at the 14th summit of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in Mecca. Prime Minister Khan said Kashmiris are peacefully struggling for freedom and deserve their right to self-determination. He said it is not justified to call the political struggle of Muslims as terrorism. He said terrorism should be separated from Islam because Islam bears no relation to this menace. The Prime Minister also called for Jerusalem to be declared the capital of Palestine. In other meetings, the Premier met Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Israeli forces have killed 2 Palestinians in Jerusalem. The troops shot and wounded 11 other Palestinians during weekly protests in Gaza and the West Bank. More than 250 Palestinians have been killed and over 23,000 others injured by Israeli forces since the start of weekly protests in last March. And in another development, Lebanon's Iran-backed Hezbollah says he will confront the US peace plan for the Middle East. In Bahrain, the US will propose a new two-state solution to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah called the blueprint a historic crime that must be stopped. He said it's unlikely Washington will launch a war against Tehran because it would burn the whole region. Nasrallah also denied charges that Hezbollah has factories in Lebanon to produce precision-guided missiles. At least 12 people have been killed in a mass shooting at a government building in the eastern U.S. state of Virginia. Police said 4 others were wounded when a municipal employee began shooting. Virginia Beach Police Chief James Cervera said the shooter was killed during a gun battle with the police. The incident unfolded at a municipal complex housing the city's public works and utilities. The shooting is the deadliest workplace gun violence in the United States since February.
Our process is always to notify family members prior to releasing names. We do know who the suspect is. We have not been successful in notifying certain family members. Once we are able to do that, we will release his name once. We're going to mention his name once, and then he will be forever referred to as the suspect, because our focus now is the dignity and respect to the victims in this case and to their families.
Moving on, former Congress President Sonia Gandhi has been elected as the chairperson of the Congress Parliamentary Party. Her name was proposed by former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. Congress President Rahul Gandhi resigned after the recent election defeat. The party must now elect a new leader. The elections left Congress with 52 lawmakers, marginally higher than the 44 who won in 2014. It is still 3 members short of qualifying for the post of Leader of the Opposition in the Lok Sabha. Ruling out an Eid ceasefire, the Taliban have said the doors of dialogue with the US will remain open, but they are still not ready to speak to the government in Kabul. Taliban leader Haibatullah Akhundzada pledged to continue fighting until the movement's objectives are reached. In an annual message before Eid, Akhundzada said the Taliban want an end to decades of conflict. The leader's statement comes after a sixth round of US-led talks last month in Qatar. At least 22 civilians have been killed by rebel fire in northwestern Syria. War monitors say 10 children are among the victims of the latest spike in violence in rebel-held Idlib province. Syria's de-escalation zone, which takes in Idlib, Hama and Aleppo, has suffered multiple breaches of the ceasefire by combatants. The buffer zone was created by Turkey and Russia in late September to avert a government offensive, but the region has come under heavy bombardment since Al-Qaeda-backed militants took it over in January. Observers say 948 people have died in northwestern Syria since April the 30th. A quarter of the dead were civilians, including 67 children. The US-led coalition says it has unintentionally killed over 1,300 civilians in airstrikes during its fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria since 2014. The official death toll is far lower than estimates made by groups which monitor the wars in both countries. Air Wars, an NGO monitoring civilian casualties from airstrikes worldwide, says coalition air attacks have killed 7,900 civilians. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says coalition strikes have killed 3,800 civilians in Syria alone. The coalition says it is still assessing 111 additional claims of civilian deaths and is ready to review fresh evidence. It says it made over 34,000 strikes between August 2014 and the April of 2019. In Sudan, the ruling military council says protests outside the defense ministry in Khartoum have become a threat to the country's stability. This came as thousands of protesters resumed their sit-in amid a deadlock in power-sharing talks. Accusing protesters of attacking its vehicles, the military has threatened to take legal action against the demonstrators. Meanwhile, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called on the two sides to exercise restraint and resume negotiations. He said the United Nations is committed to supporting the Sudanese stakeholders in their efforts to build lasting peace. A political crisis has gripped Sudan since former President Omar al-Bashir was overthrown on April the 11th. The US has accused China of destabilizing Asia. This comes after the Chinese Defense Minister Wei Fenghe said the US must uphold its commitment to the One China policy. More in this report.
Singapore is hosting the annual Shangri-La Security Dialogue, attended by key officials from over 40 countries. This year's event takes place in the middle of a simmering clash between China and the US on everything from cybersecurity to trade. On the sidelines, Chinese Defense Minister Wei Fenghe met US Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan. During the meeting, Fenghe stressed the security of the South China Sea.
The minister stressed in particular on the Taiwan issue. He pointed out recently the United States had some unconstructive words and actions which China resolutely opposes. The United States should not underestimate China's determination, will, and capabilities to safeguard its sovereignty and territory.
Shanahan replied by accusing Beijing of destabilizing Asia, saying the US will not ignore Chinese behavior.
Perhaps the greatest long-term threat to the vital interests of the states across the region comes from actors who seek to undermine rather than uphold the rules-based international order. These actors undermine the system by using indirect, incremental actions and rhetorical devices to exploit others economically and diplomatically and coerce them militarily.
Against this background, Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has pressed China and the US not to pressure small countries into taking sides.
In relation to the story, the United States has said it will stop sharing security information with nations using Huawei-made next-generation networks. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said his country will not allow the flow of data through insecure networks. Details here.
In a time of distrust and mutual suspicion, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has kicked off his European tour. His first appointment is Germany, making up for a cancelled visit in early May. There, he warned of massive costs if the US can't have confidence in Germany's communication network. Pompeo was speaking after meeting his opposite number, Heiko Maas. The Secretary of State said the US could begin withholding data on citizens or on national security.
We also had conversations today about other elements of China. We've been pretty clear about how we view the risks connected to Huawei and 5G infrastructure. The Internet of the future must have Western values embedded within it.
Pompeo also urged Germany to ban Iranian-backed Hezbollah and boost military spending.
We're also open to get Germany's help, and we talked about this today, in recognizing Hezbollah as a unified entity and banning it from Germany, as our ally, the United Kingdom, did this year.
The US is at odds with its German allies on a host of issues, from trade to military spending and non-nuclear proliferation.
Algerian police have arrested dozens of people ahead of weekly protests against the country's rulers. Hundreds of protesters gathered in Algiers for the 15th consecutive weekend to keep the pressure on the caretaker government. On April the 2nd, the protest movement forced the long-lasting president Abdelaziz Bouteflika to step down. An interim president has been appointed by parliament, which has set July the 4th for the country's postponed presidential election. Demonstrations have continued to press demands for an overhaul of Algeria's political system. In Thailand, both houses of the Thai parliament will vote to elect a prime minister on June the 5th. The votes in the House of Representatives and the Senate will officially restore civilian rule after 5 years of military government. A prime minister will need the support of at least 376 members of both houses of parliament. Junta leader Prayuth Chan-o-cha, who came to power in a 2014 coup, is seen as favorite with support in the upper house. The recently held general election was a setback to junta supporters who claim a democratic front wants to keep the military out of politics. Protesters rallying against the Honduran government have set fire to the U.S. embassy in the capital, Tegucigalpa. The fire was set at an entrance to the embassy, and smoke could be seen billowing across the building. Local firefighters eventually put out the flames. It is only a day since tens of thousands marched against President Juan Orlando's education and healthcare policies. They demanded the immediate resignation of the president. Well, it's time for us to take a short break. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back after the break. We'll take you to South America, where Venezuela's crumbling hospitals are taking a heavy toll on the country's children. The country's health system is chronically short of staff and basic supplies. More in this report.
Venezuela is going through an economic meltdown. This chaos has badly affected the country's healthcare system. Hospitals in Venezuela are barely functioning, and children are among its hardest hit victims.
It is so sad to lose him, but I don't know how to say. There are no words to talk about. Someone you love so much, you loved, and you lose him. To lose him this way, he vanishes, and there is nothing you can do.
The United Nations says a quarter of Venezuela's 30 million people are in need of aid. The pharmaceutical industry says the country lacks 85% of the medicine it needs.
I know that with help, with support, with donations, with whatever, the children could last longer. Without it, these lives are going to die out. one after the other, one after the other. I tell you, these children and deaths won't be the last ones.
Venezuelans say the government has turned a blind eye to the healthcare crisis. The International Monetary Fund predicts inflation in the country will reach a staggering 10 million% in 2019.
A United Nations investigator says WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has suffered psychological torture. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer, renewed a call for Assange not to be extradited to the United States. Details in this report.
The United States is seeking the extradition of Julian Assange for one of the biggest ever leaks of classified information. Assange is currently detained in London prison. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer, who visited Assange on May 9th, said he will face a politicized show trial if extradited to US.
I am appalled at the sustained and concerted abuse that Mr. Assange has been exposed to at the hands of democratic states over a period of almost a decade. And thirdly, I am seriously, gravely concerned that if this man were to be extradited to the United States, he would be exposed to a politicized show trial in grave violations of his human rights.
Besides espionage charges, Julian Assange is also facing a sexual assault investigation. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer, has also voiced concern at US charges laid against Assange.
Detention conditions in the United States, both at the federal and the state level, in some places there are routine practices that my predecessors and I have consistently qualified as being in violation of the prohibition of torture and ill treatment. So I don't think we could expect Julian Assange to get a fair trial.
Assange is currently serving a 50-week sentence for skipping bail while fighting extradition to the US. He faces 18 US criminal counts and decades in prison if convicted of the charges against him.
Small businesses in Mexico are finding ways to turn a foul-smelling seaweed into something useful. Innovation is turning the putrid alga into useful, eco-friendly products. More in this report.
The unwelcome visitor has plagued the beauty of Yucatan Peninsula, which separates the Gulf of Mexico from the Caribbean Sea. The thick seaweed turned the crystalline water brown and filled the air with rotten egg smell. But instead of surrendering to the problematic seaweed, a group of young entrepreneurs decided to make sustainable products that turned this seaweed into livestock feed and fertilizer, as well as creams and other cosmetics.
I decided to not worry but to get busy instead and turn this into a virtuous cycle. What does that mean? By cleaning the beaches, creating jobs, and starting to build sargassum bricks.
After successfully developing feed for livestock, entrepreneurs have also developed quality shoes for business purposes.
Each shoe uses 100 grams of sargassum. It's 100 grams specifically of seaweed. It has to go through a cleaning process, a drying process, and a crushing process to be able to get it to where we need it for it to enter production.
Entrepreneurs are now striving to develop food products for human consumption.
In the world of business, US President Donald Trump has ended India's special trade status that exempts billions of dollars of exports from American tariffs. India's preferential market access to the US will be terminated as of June the 5th. Trump said India has not assured the US of providing equitable and reasonable access to its markets. India is the biggest beneficiary of the GSP, which allows its preferential duty-free imports of up to $5.6 billion. India has raised the prospect of higher import duties on more than 20 US goods after being dropped from the program. And US President Donald Trump's plan to impose tariffs on all Mexican goods could hurt the global economy. The Mexican peso, US futures, and Asian stock markets tumbled when the plan was announced. Details in this report.
President Donald Trump has warned he will impose tariffs on all Mexican goods if the country does not end the flow of illegal migrants. The plan would levy a 5% tariff on Mexican imports beginning on June the 10th. It will increase monthly until it hits 25% on October the 1st. The announcement startled the business community, while analysts believe American consumers will suffer too.
Let's remember that tariffs are not borne by the Mexican government. These tariffs, these costs are borne by American consumers and businesses. And this supply chain cannot be simply replicated in the United States overnight, meaning we cannot begin to grow cherry tomatoes in Iowa in the wintertime.
Trump's decision coincided with the day Mexico started a formal process to ratify a free trade deal with the US and Canada.
Well, the one thing that's most mystifying about this coming up the way that it has is that the U.S. and Mexico and Canada have already forged a trade agreement. And so Mexico looks at this and says, well, we thought we had already forged an agreement with the United States on trade. And so was that agreement not made in good faith? Are we to go back to the bargaining table?
The tariffs news hit the share prices of Japanese car makers who ship cars from Mexico to the U.S. It rattled investors who fear worsening trade friction will hurt the global economy.
And of course, the question then is, does the U.S. actually impose these tariffs? Do they escalate to 25% of the cost of these imports? And certainly that would be chaotic not only for the Mexican economy, but for the U.S. economy ultimately.
As a result of Trump's Chinese trade war, Mexico became the biggest U.S. trade partner in goods. Raising tariffs increases the risk of damaged economic relations between Mexico and the U.S.
An increase in Chinese tariffs on $60 billion worth of U.S. goods has just taken effect. Washington has already imposed higher tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods in May. China had previously imposed tariffs on between 5 to 10% on over 5,000 U.S. products. It has also announced plans to blacklist some foreign firms and individuals it thinks are harmful to the country's interests. China's Commerce Ministry said it has decided to create what it calls an undesirable entities list to combat unilateralism and trade protectionism. Meanwhile, China has announced it will release a white paper on trade talks with Washington on Sunday. And Colombia's Esteban Chavez has won the 19th stage of the Giro d'Italia, while Antonio Carapaz retained the overall leader's pink jersey. Details here.
It was an emotional day for Esteban Chavez and his family as he claimed stage 19 of the Giro d'Italia. It was Chavez's first win since being diagnosed with Epstein-Barr virus while competing in last year's Giro. The Michelton Scott rider was part of the day's breakaway that remained clear of the peloton. He crossed the line 10 seconds ahead of Andrea Vendrame, who suffered 2 mechanical failures in the final 4 kilometers of the uphill finish. Amaro Antunes finished third, 12 seconds behind the winner Esteban Chavez. Richard Antonio Carapaz retained the overall lead, still 1 minute and 54 seconds ahead of Vincenzo Nibali.
And now let's take a quick look at the weather around the globe. These are all the stories we have for you this hour. Stay tuned for further updates to Indus News.